It was meant to be a typical night in the peaceful hills of rural Tennessee. David "Stringbean" Akeman, a popular banjo player, comedian, and country music icon, had just ended his performance at the Grand Ole Opry. The lights had dimmed, but the laughter of his fans lingered in the air, and his feet churned up familiar dust as he made his way home with his wife, Estelle. What occurred next, however, would forever shatter Music City's tranquility and leave a gory scar in the heart of country music history. November 10, 1973. Many people in Nashville still remember that day vividly. By the morning of the 11th, police and reporters would have surrounded the Akeman's modest cabin just outside Ridgetop. 2 bodies, a ransacked house, and a shaken music community, wondering who to trust or whether the world they knew had altered forever. Stringbean and Estelle had been slain by intruders who waited for them to return from the Opry. What is the motive? There are rumors of money being concealed in the house, but what they didn't realize was that the true fortune would go undiscovered for decades. Stringbean was more than just another entertainer. He was a national treasure, with his tall, lanky figure jammed into ridiculously large dungarees. He was a living embodiment of Americana. His banjo twang could get an audience on their feet, but his humility, generosity, and traditional beliefs made him popular well beyond the stage. He was the heart of hee-haw, the spirit of the Opry, and a dependable friend to many in the country music industry. That was what made his death so difficult to accept. It felt as if something sacred had been defiled. For years, the case tormented not only fans, but also the musicians who shared dressing rooms and tour buses with him. Whispers permeated the Grand Ole Opry's hallways. Why Stringbean? Who would do this? And most cruelly, what did they actually take? As time passed, the secret began to unfold. However, what was disclosed surprised even those who felt they understood the whole tale. The murder was more than just a house invasion. It was about betrayal, greed, and the evil underbelly that can infiltrate even the most wholesome of lives. And when the complete tale emerged decades later, it was not good. This is Stringbean's untold narrative, and why, even now, Nashville has never really recovered. Before becoming a victim in one of country music's most terrible, David "Stringbean" Akeman represented humor, humility, and true Appalachian talent. Despite his wiry size and carefully exaggerated stage image, Stringbean embodied a disappearing America, the hard-working, God-fearing, blue-collar entertainer who never forgot his roots. David Akeman, born in 1915 in Annville, Kentucky, grew up in a modest environment. He was raised during the Great Depression, and those difficult years instilled in him a lifelong sense of caution and self-reliance. Money was scarce. Luxury was a myth. Even as he grew older and his name became linked with fame on the Grand Ole Opry stage, he never lost sight of his farm boy upbringing, which taught him to save, protect, and live simply. His talent with the banjo was apparent. When he first picked up the instrument as a kid, he immediately developed a distinct claw hammer technique that combined old-time mountain music with current vitality. By the 1940s, he was performing with Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys. Yes, the father of bluegrass. And as Monroe's fame grew, so did Stringbean's. While Monroe developed a musical empire, Stringbean carved out an own path for himself as a comic and musician. Stringbean's dual talent made him an ideal choice for Hee Haw, the country variety show that soared in popularity in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Stringbean rose to prominence alongside Buck Owens and Roy Clark. His characteristic look, an enormous shirt tucked into trousers that dropped down to his knees, combined with his dry, homegrown humor, earned him an instant fan following. His skits, which were always flavored with harmless mischief, gave audiences the impression that they were sitting on the front porch of an old friend's cabin. Offstage, Stringbean was precisely who he appeared to be: friendly, private, and surprisingly reserved. He did not drink, he did not seek fame, he did not even trust banks. That final characteristic, it turns out, would prove terribly essential. He was known among his closest associates for concealing significant sums of cash at home, allegedly packed in walls, boots, or mason jars, and was a throwback of a time when individuals buried their wealth because they didn't trust banks. His wife, Estelle, was his rock, quiet, faithful, and equally frugal as her husband. The two were inseparable, and despite the fact that they did not have children, their ridgetop home was filled with love, laughter, and an air of old-fashioned decency that made guests feel as if they were entering a gentler, kinder world. Despite his charm and success, Stringbean remained apprehensive of his surroundings. Fame did not provide security. Rather, it made him more protective. He frequently stated that he desired to live simply and not call attention to his fortune, even if it meant wearing patched-up clothes and driving older cars. He distrusted modern banks, expecting collapse or robbery, and his paranoia, which stemmed from a Depression-era survival instinct, eventually made him a target. Stringbean performed in packed theaters and made millions during his career. But the bitter irony is that his simplicity, his refusal to modernize his financial habits, set the setting for his tragic death. The man playing the banjo was more than just a performance. He was a symbol of a disappearing America, and as Nashville would discover the hard way, killing someone like Stringbean means more than just losing a man. You lose an entire era. November 10, 1973, was intended to be a typical Saturday night in Nashville. The Grand Ole Opry stage erupted with laughter and banjo twangs as Stringbean ended his performance, humble as always, smiling beneath his enormous shirt and absurdly low-hanging trousers. Nobody in the audience could have predicted that it would be David Stringbean Akeman's final performance. He and his wife Estelle left the Ryman Auditorium late that evening, returning to their private property in Ridgetop, Tennessee, about 25 miles north of Nashville. It was their typical routine. No fuss, no entourage, just a peaceful drive through the Tennessee night. But two guys lurked in the shadows of that idyllic countryside, watching and waiting. Brothers John and Marvin Douglas had heard the rumors, the same murmurs that had circulated throughout Music City for years, that Stringbean did not trust banks and kept significant quantities of money concealed within his home. For them, he was an easy target, an elderly man, harmless and predictable, but they didn't realize Stringbean was likewise cautious. He kept a pistol in his boot, he scanned his surroundings, and most significantly, he went home prepared for anything. When Stringbean came into the driveway that night, the Douglases were already inside the cabin, preparing to ambush the newlyweds. What happened next shocked not only the country music world, but the entire country. As he walked through the front door, Stringbean found traces of a break-in. The cabin, which he had kept so well organized, was plainly disturbed, and when he saw Marvin Douglas inside, the confrontation turned fatal. Stringbean reached for his revolver, but it was too late. Gunshots rang out. He was shot near the fireplace. Hearing the disturbance, Estelle dashed from the car towards the cabin, only to be gunned down outside, where her body was subsequently discovered behind a fence post, attempting to flee. The crime was as inexplicable as it was cruel. The Douglases apparently found relatively little cash while scouring the cabin. Despite the rumors, Stringbean did not keep the amount of money that the burglars expected laying around. What they obtained was minimal. What they destroyed was invaluable. When the bodies were discovered the next morning by fellow Opry star Grandpa Jones, who had come to see his close friend, shock and anguish swept across Nashville like a cold wind. Jones discovered the pair and promptly alerted the authorities, but the scene was already etched in his memory, haunting him for the rest of his life. The response from the country music community was quick and emotional. Stars like Roy Acuff, Minnie Pearl, and Porter Wagner couldn't believe it. The cast of Hee Haw sobbed openly. The Grand Ole Opry entered into grief. Fans throughout the country lit candles, sang hymns, and left mementos at the foot of the Ryman stage. It was more than simply losing a performer. It was also losing a symbol of civility in an increasingly turbulent world. For the first time in a long time, Nashville felt threatened. Artists began to question their homes, habits, and sense of security. Country music, which had long prided itself on being grounded in tradition, family, and community, suddenly had a sobering reminder that fame and money, no matter how small, can lead to darkness. The killers were apprehended relatively quickly. The Douglas brothers were apprehended within a few days. One of them, John, was easily recognized as the gunman, and Marvin was convicted as an accomplice. They were condemned to life in jail, but Marvin was granted release in 2014, causing uproar among fans and the remaining country music community. Even if justice was served, the damage was irreversible. The killings of Stringbean and Estelle Akeman sent a terrifying message through the music industry. Fame could not protect you. Money made you susceptible, and even the quietest among us could die the loudest deaths. In the decades since, no tragedy has haunted Nashville in the same way, because when they murdered Stringbean, they killed more than just a man. They killed a sense of security that may never be totally restored. The names John and Marvin Douglas will live on in the annals of country music tragedy, not because they were renowned outlaws, but because their motivations were pitifully real: greed, envy, and betrayal by a man who had never done them wrong. The Douglas brothers were not hardened criminals or experienced thieves. They were local boys from the same Tennessee backroads that Stringbean had known his entire life. This truth made the betrayal much more heartbreaking. They weren't strangers. They came from the same world as Stringbean, growing up with the same small-town ideals and walking down the same streets. However, those principles corroded with time, giving birth to animosity and a longing for something they believed the world owed them. The plan was not complex. In reality, it was painfully amateurish. For years, John and Marvin had heard rumors that Stringbean kept money hidden in his cabin. Stories circulated that he distrusted banks and kept wads of cash in mason jars, concealed beneath floors or behind loose bricks in the chimney. Whether or not the rumors were real did not appear to matter. The brothers believed them. That belief was sufficient to turn envy into a murder plan. John Douglas, the older of the two, was the ringleader. He was known for his short temper and bad decision-making. Marvin, who was younger and more reticent, followed in his brother's footsteps, possibly out of loyalty, fear, or weakness. They decided to break into Stringbean's cabin on the night he was gone performing at the Opry. But what they didn't expect was Stringbean to return alert and armed. When Stringbean and Estelle arrived, the brothers had already entered. What followed was a cold-blooded ambush rather than an equal encounter. John shot Stringbean before he could reach for the revolver in his boot. Estelle attempted to flee, unknowing and afraid, but was pursued and cruelly shot outdoors. Everyone was taken aback by the violence, not only because it occurred, but also because of who perpetrated it. The Douglas brothers were no strangers to the Akemans. They knew who Stringbean was. They recognized the type of man he was: generous, humble, and fiercely protective of Estelle. That made their behavior much more terrifying. They did not simply steal, they betrayed a neighbor, a symbol, and a friend. And for what? Several $100s. Despite rumors of buried fortunes, the haul was small. The cabin did not produce the tremendous sums that the brothers expected. The genuine money, more than $20,000 in savings, was subsequently discovered hidden in a metal box behind a wall that neither of them noticed. In the end, they took life while leaving the money. The court system acted quickly. Both brothers were apprehended only days after the murders. The evidence was substantial, and the country music community put pressure on prosecutors to guarantee that no mercy was offered. John was sentenced to life in jail and eventually died there. Marvin, the calmer brother, was likewise sentenced to life in prison, but he was controversially granted parole in 2014 after serving more than 40 years. His release was welcomed with a barrage of public criticism. Fans, artists, and survivors of the Akemans questioned how a man responsible for such a premeditated, horrific crime could possibly go free. But legally, Marvin had done his sentence. Morally, many feared he would never be able to. What is most heartbreaking is that Stringbean's killers came from within his world, not from without. They weren't strangers storming the gates of fame. They were products of the same land, music, and rural rhythm of existence. But while Stringbean found peace in humility, they found wrath in resentment. And when that animosity boiled over, it took not only a man and his wife's lives, but also an entire genre's sense of innocence. As authorities dug around the blood-stained cabin following the double killing, they discovered a terrible detail that added to the tragedy's heartbreak. The killers never found what they were looking for. The entire motive for the murder of Stringbean and Estelle Akeman stemmed from a regional legend. Stringbean had his earnings hidden somewhere in the house. What about the terrible irony? The rumor was genuine, but the killers completely missed it. For years, musicians, acquaintances, and locals had whispered that Stringbean did not trust banks. He grew up in poverty during the Great Depression and never got over the shock of financial insecurity. He had seen neighbors lose everything when banks failed, and that memory haunted him, even as fame brought fortune. Instead of depositing his winnings, Stringbean surreptitiously put money away in various hiding places throughout the cabin. He never flaunted it. There was no dazzling jewelry or luxurious autos, just a man in dungarees living quietly with the woman he loved, and a growing stash of cash hidden from view. When the Douglas brothers broke in, they expected to find wealth. Instead, they discovered a few $100 in plain sight and panicked. Their shoddy, nasty crime earned them almost nothing. In fact, when police arrived after the murders, they discovered more than $20,000 in cash, stored inside a strongbox, hidden behind a masonry wall, fully untouched. Stringbean had been shot only a few feet away. The killers strolled right by it. The twisted irony was oppressive. Stringbean died defending a riches that his assassins couldn't even locate, and Estelle, who had earlier advised him to use a bank instead of hiding it, perished while attempting to avoid a myth-based crime. The money became a symbol, not just of Stringbean's old-school skepticism, but also of his senseless death. The riches did not save him. It never made the ones who killed him rich. Following the incident, law enforcement retrieved the hidden cash and returned it to Stringbean's estate. However, it acted as a terrible reminder of everything that had gone wrong that evening. The greed, the ignorance, the complete wasting of life. It is one thing to lose a legend, it is another to lose someone for nothing. The arrests occurred quickly, but for many in Nashville, they did not come soon enough. Just days after the gruesome killings of Stringbean and Estelle Akeman, law enforcement targeted cousins John A. Brown and Marvin Douglas, small-time crooks from a nearby town with a reputation for trouble. The case broke when one of the brothers couldn't stop talking. In a drunken conversation, he alluded to involvement in a crime bigger than anything the cops could handle. Word spread quickly. Investigators eventually linked them to the scene using physical evidence, confessions, and their own careless eagerness to spend the little money they'd stolen. The specifics of the crime were revealed in court, shocking the country music industry and horrified the nation. Prosecutors created a picture of deliberate greed. Two guys believed rumors about Stringbean's money and decided to take it by force. Witnesses testified to their careless attitude following the murders. Neither expressed regret. It wasn't simply a botched heist, it was an execution. In 1973, both were convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Fans, friends, and members of the Grand Ole Opry family all felt relieved. However, justice, while given on paper, did not restore what had been destroyed. Over time, the case faded from national news, but not from the hearts of those who knew and loved the Akemans. Every parole hearing reopened the wounds. Every court appearance by a Douglas cousin felt like a ghost returning to the stage. Then came the surprise in 2014. After more than 40 years in jail, Marvin Douglas was ready for parole. He presented his case as sorry, repentant, and a transformed man. Those who had fought for Stringbean's legacy, however, were unaffected. Former Opry singers, acquaintances, and even fans penned emails imploring the board to reject it. Among them was country singer and fellow Opry great Ricky Skaggs, who had grown up idolizing Stringbean. His voice was clear. Some people don't deserve a second act. Yet parole was granted. Marvin stepped out of prison a free man, older and quieter, but with the weight of a crime that could never be forgotten. It provoked indignation. particularly among those who had long protected the Akeman family's memory. In contrast, John A. Brown was never released from prison. In 2003, he died in prison, enduring a life sentence that would never be finished. His latter years were spent alone, battling illness and allegedly never expressing public regret. In death, as in life, he maintained a dismal silence. Stringbean and Estelle's final chapter was written not in a courtroom, but in the quiet corners of history, through tribute concerts, country ballads, and the laughter of those who remembered the man with the banjo and long shirt. Their deaths shocked Nashville. Their legacy restored it, and as justice was progressively served, one thing became clear. The true sentence was not simply imprisonment, but knowing the world had not forgotten. The murders of Stringbean and Estelle Akeman were more than just a tragic end to two adored figures. They were a brutal reminder that even at the heart of country music, where songs celebrate devotion and love, darkness can creep in when greed trumps morality. At its foundation, the Stringbean case reveals a terrifying reality. Fame can be a double-edged sword. David Akeman received delight, admiration, and recognition, but he also became a target. His modest demeanor, rural upbringing, and rumors of cash concealed in the house made him an easy target for guys whose jealousy outweighed any morality. The killers stole more than just money. They stole the innocence of an entire town. It also called into question a fundamental aspect of the Southern small-town mythos: trust. Stringbean had spent his life surrounded by friends, fans, and fellow entertainers. He never flaunted riches or status, and he never imagined the world around him could become so chilly. And yet it did, not from strangers in a distant place, but from residents who had most likely seen him play. But maybe the most frightening aspect is greed, not just the act itself, but the conviction that a man's existence can be reduced to the money in his wallet. A living legend could be brought to an end because of a rumor that the cost of fame, even one founded on laughter and banjos, may be your life. The Stringbean tragedy can still be heard in the halls of the Grand Ole Opry and on Tennessee porches today. It serves as a warning. Trust must be guarded. Celebrity must be treated with caution. And no matter how lowly the star, there will always be some who see only the shine and not the soul. Stringbean's music makes people happy. His death caused them to mourn. But his experience, both joyful and terrible, prompted them to consider. And that may be the most potent legacy of all.